guys can see a photo of a tree guard.
Yep.
Looks good, Sal.
Yep, got that.
Right. Very good. Well, we'll kick off. Welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight to our Planting New Paddock Trees workshop. I'm Sally Day. I'm the project officer working for Burgoyne Creek, Springhurst and Biowatha and Hodgson and Horseshoe Creeks for this project. And we're also thankful to have Will Ford from Trust for Nature here tonight to help co-present. And thanks to Alandi Durling, the Mid Ovens Landcare facilitator, for hosting our session. So just a little bit of an overview of this project. So we've received this funding through the Smart Farms Small Grants Program, round 3, which is funded through the National Landcare Program. And the aim of our project is to raise awareness and implement on-ground management actions to protect our waterways and paddock trees in those 3 Landcare Group areas. And we've got 2 components to the program. So the first one is a series of information workshops, which is aimed at encouraging best practice management for paddock trees and waterways. And the second part of our project is to fund some on-ground works. So that we have an expression of interest phase that is open at the moment. And that's basically if people are interested in doing works on their waterways or paddock trees, they can put in a submission under that. And we'll have a bit of a look at it through the committee. We're going to fund the development of some site plans for people and go out and do some one-on-one visits on properties to look at the outcomes that they're trying to achieve and how we might best achieve that on their property. And we do have some funding to actually do some fencing and revegetation programs on properties as well. So 3 Landcare groups all working together, which is a fantastic outcome for our local area. Okay, so just an outline of tonight's session. So we're just going to run through the difference between planting new trees and protecting natural recruitment. We'll talk a bit about the aims of planting paddock trees. So whether we're trying to have a biodiversity outcome or our property, or whether we'd like to build stock shade, or whether it might be a bit of a mix of both. We're going to talk about how to choose appropriate species for your property. Some discussion around tree density and what you might like to aim for. Will and I are going to have a bit of a chat about different guard choices, pros and cons, and how you can go about installing them on your place. Different planting arrangements in the paddocks, and just some tips that we've learned in the last couple of years from implementing on-ground projects with planting new paddock trees. So first up, what can we do to help? I guess this is a bit of a recap of our earlier paddock tree workshops that we have had, and I will send through a link to those webinar recordings so that you can have a look if you weren't able to make the earlier sessions. But basically, what we talked about the values and threats to our large old paddock trees in the landscape. And so this particular webinar tonight is actually talking about some of the practical action that we can take to address the decline in paddock trees in our landscape. So there's really 3 steps, 3 things that we can do. So the first one is protect the old guys. So that's your big old trees in your paddock, and look after those. And then that leads into talking about our planting side of things. We can encourage natural regeneration in the paddocks. And the third way is to actually plant replacement trees. So we're really going to talk about the second and third part of that program tonight. Okay, so protecting natural recruitment, why would we do that? What are the pros and cons, I guess? Well, it's adapted to local conditions. The trees that are left in our landscape here are obviously the survivors and the battlers because they've been here the longest. So a tree that self-seeds naturally is going to have a stronger root system than one that you plant. So in that way, growth rates tend to be better than with planted tube stock, and often the trees will be really robust and they'll get going earlier. One of the tips with this is that it is a good idea to try and guard them or protect them before they get grazed, or your tree shape may be a little bit compromised. If they get munched off at the base time and time again, you will get a tree that loses that central leader and will have a lot of coppicing and side shoots from the base. Now, with a bit of careful pruning, if you're good with a pair of secateurs, you might be able to train that into a slightly better shape over time. But if you can protect your tree as soon as it's germinated, they're the ones that'll end up giving you the best shape with nice, strong central leaders and a fuller canopy. So one of the cons, I guess, is that natural recruitment often results from various events. So when we have species like river red gum that germinate after flooding, you may get them very thick in some areas along waterways or low depressions on your property. And so they might need thinning out over time. Or also in some areas where you get a lot of windblown seed thrown off your large canopy trees, they might come up really thick. And that saying, thick as a dog's back, probably applies to natural regen in some places around our catchment. So they may need to be a bit thinned out over time, and there are different ways to do that. It's probably cheaper and less work if you can encourage trees on your property to regenerate naturally rather than having to go around and constantly replant in areas around your property. So in summary, I think that natural recruitment, it's great. It's the cheapest way and the easiest way to build vegetation on your property. But be selective and choose the locations and the individual trees that work for you in your spaces. So if you want to encourage regen around troughs or nearby, maybe you retain some trees in some areas and you don't keep everything. So pick the healthiest looking trees and the strongest ones and try and guard those and use those to encourage them to become full trees. So just a nice photo there. This is in the Greta catchment. So someone's just put up, like, I think it's a single hot wire really around this windblown seed that's blown in off a roadside reserve. And they've just popped that up to keep cattle out until those trees get big enough to withstand some browsing by stock. And then you could take that fence down and let the cattle into that area if you like, or you could continue to fence it out for more years depending on what your objectives are. So seed's often deposited in that leeward side of road reserves, and that is a really good opportunity when the land's rested or destocked that you might start to see some of that regeneration emerging. So if it can be protected early, best form of the tree is preserved and you'll get healthy, well-shaped trees. From in point of view of the style of fencing, probably electric fencing is the easiest to do this with because it can be really quick. You can pop in a few star pickets, run a hot wire and you're done. If you run with a conventional strained fence, it's probably going to take you a bit more effort and a bit more money to buy your materials to do this. So before I mentioned that you might need to thin them, and this is probably a classic example where you've got a really close thicket of red gums coming up in a clump. So thinning is really to remove the trees that you don't want so that the remaining trees grow with a full well-shaped canopy. So rather than all competing for light and space and growing up very tall and thin and whippy, you can selectively go through and mark the ones you want to keep and remove the others. So that might be removing, say, every 9 out of 10 plants to allow the remaining ones to grow into good, healthy specimens. So the earlier that you do that, probably the better. And that can be just achieved by cutting and painting. It's probably the easiest and the quickest. And that's something that I'd encourage everyone to do if they get their regen come up very thickly. So your fencing might be permanent or temporary, like I just talked about. If you decide to make it a permanent fence, you'll need to include a gate to help you move stock in and out of those areas. And either way, you'll probably need to keep the fence up for up to 5 years, depending on what type of stock you run and your grazing regime on your property. Damage to plants and trees that have regenerated like this, probably much less in paddocks when they're rotationally grazed versus set stocked. And so if you're running rotational grazing system on your property, you know, one hot wire might be all you need to protect your trees, depending on, again, what type of stock you're using. But because they're in the paddocks a lot less, they're much less likely to be leaning and pushing on the fence for extended periods. The other thing to consider is whether you want to use that area where, so in this instance, we've got like a square fence around these regenerated, I think they are yellow box. If you want to use that as a shade block down the track, it might be worth to pop a permanent fence up and use it gated, and you might decide to keep your cattle out of that area for 10 months of the year, and just to let them have access in for the hottest 2 months over summer as a good area for shade. And then that rests those trees for the other months of the year and gives them the optimal chance of surviving and not being impacted by stock. Also, blocks like this make really great areas for protection for really cold spells over winter. So it is worth thinking about whether you want to put up a temporary fence, in which case it's going to be removed down the track, or whether you want to turn it into a proper shade block for use as a shade asset on your property. So if we move on to planting new tube stock, one of the advantages of planting new tube stock is that you can bring back species that might be low in numbers on your farm. So if for one reason or another you don't have something that you'd like for a particular species that used to be there that now isn't or is in lower numbers, you can build that up by actually planting those back into the landscape. So it is really important to consider how stock tolerant that species is. You know, some of our rough stringy bark trees don't cope well with a lot of stock access because the cattle are going to rub and pull off the bark. So you'll have a feel for what works best on your property in terms of which are the, you know, the most hardest wearing trees, I guess. So often those are the ones with smooth bark or the really, really rough fibrous bark like your iron barks that can be really tolerant to stock. One of the other things to consider is that when you plant new tube stock, you can plant exactly where you need the shade. So if you want some shade around your troughs and you don't have it, you can target placement of trees into that space. The other thing to think about is the cost and time involved in planting. So you've got to actually purchase a tree, you know, prepare the ground, do the planting, and then often you're going to have to water over the first summer to get those going and through the summer. Your natural recruitment, probably more likely to just cope on the natural rainfall that you get and won't need as much supplementary watering, if at all. So there is a sort of a bigger investment in terms of purchase costs for materials and your time. So planting new tube stock gives you a better control of the location and the species that you put into that area, but it does add some cost and time for you.
I might just jump in for a sec there, Sal.
Yeah, go for it, Will.
There's just been a question from Marie, who's asked, by cutting and painting, do you mean painting Roundup on the stump? And I'd encourage anyone else who's got a question to pop it in the chat function, and then perhaps whoever's not talking can keep an eye on that and read it out to you, Sal.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And yes, Maria, that's exactly what I meant. So you can just use, oh, look, when I do it at home, I just use straight Roundup on a paintbrush. Just have some in a little container and paint it straight on. But Will, what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, different strokes for different folks. I like to use a little spray bottle.
Yep.
You can tend to go 50-50, especially if you're doing it in winter when Roundup is really viscous. But the critical thing is just to get it on, you know, within say 20 seconds of cutting the stump before the plant stops translocating resources. So you really want it to draw the herbicide down into the roots. Otherwise, it will sucker again. That's
great. All right, thanks, Will. Good question, Maria. Yep, please, everyone, send your questions in, and we will have a question and answer session at the end. Sorry, I didn't mention that at the start. I think it's really worth considering what the primary aim of your project is before you start off. And I've sort of broken our aims into two groups, and that's either that you might be planting trees for productivity, or you might be planting trees for biodiversity on your property, or you might have a bit of a crossover of both. Generally, if we're planting trees for productivity, our aim is going to be around the provision of shade for stock. So it might be that you are losing trees on your property now and you're worried that you don't have enough shade, and so you're trying to replace the trees that are being lost through old age or dieback or impacts of stock. There's a whole range of things that we talked about in our earlier workshop. Or it might be that you actually want to increase and build shade for stock on your property. So instead of having two trees per paddock, you want to grow that to 4 trees per paddock or something like that. That might be your aim. Probably the third option that I thought about it is that by planting new trees in your paddocks, you actually help to take pressure off your older habitat-rich trees. So the ones with all the hollows, the really large canopies, the oldest trees in your paddock, by planting other shade trees in the same paddock, you're going to split that stock impact across a greater area. So that might be your aim, is to protect your old trees by planting new trees. Or the fourth one is that you might just have, you know, a replacement policy or an insurance policy for the future, in that, you know, maybe you're not losing trees at the moment, but start getting some additional shade going now, so that if you do, you've got new ones coming through at progressively different ages in your paddock. And I think that all of those are different aims around building shade, and it's probably good to have a think about exactly what you need for your place. Because you need to remember that it's going to be at least 5 or maybe 10 years before the trees that you plant today are going to be providing decent levels of shade for your stock. So if we had a crystal ball, it'd be great. We could look forward into the future and see what we need and what the climate's going to be like. But I think that my take-home message for everyone today is that this is something that's important that we need to get started on today. If we think about planting trees for biodiversity, these are some of the reasons that I came up with, and Will might have something to add to this as well. But certainly, probably the primary one is to use those trees as stepping stones for connectivity across the landscape. So linking patches of remnant vegetation, which might be our roadside vegetation, our vegetation along our waterways and our creeks, or larger blocks on properties that you might want to link. So these trees can be used as stepping stones through those areas. The second point that I had down is food and habitat for specific species, and that flows into the Bush for Birds project that Will has been working on through Trust for Nature in the North East CMA, of providing habitat for a regent honeyeater and is it swift parrot, Will? Yep. So those two birds, they're here and they're in our area over winter. And so part of that project is planting trees that benefit those two species, which are basically winter flowering eucalypts. Do you want to jump in, Will?
You've given a pretty good rundown there, Sal. I'd probably just add that a lot of the resources that these birds rely on out in the bush, in national parks and bush on private land, we're actually losing large old hollow bearing trees, and they're the old trees that are so important for nectar for these species as well, through attrition and through events like bushfires and droughts. And what these species really need is the nectar producing species that are actually not just growing in the hills and in the bush areas, but in the prime agricultural areas as well, because that's where they're going to access the best resources. And that's one of the main reasons why these species are in such severe decline. So,
I mean, and that way, if we go and plant new, so the species that we've been focusing on for your regents and your swifties has been ironbark. What else have we got? White box, yellow box. What else, Will? What are the ones that are winter flowering for those species?
They're the key species. They also use indirectly, but Blakely's red gums, because they tend to have lerps on them, which are a sugary coating produced by insects, and the regents and swifties will actually feed on that as well. So Blakely's red gum is also a really important species.
And so by planting new paddock trees of those 4 key species that we've just mentioned, that's going to add to the overall nectar produced by that species in the landscape, but it's also going to take a bit of pressure off the remaining large old paddock trees that we've got. So that can benefit stock and biodiversity as well, because like Will said, we want to hang on to those large old trees that have got the hollows and the biggest supplies of nectar, that have the longest flowering. That's really important. So planting new trees is going to benefit both of those things on your property, and it's just probably a question of what your aims are as to how you achieve it, and that's why we'll talk a bit further about that in a minute. So some notes on species selection, and we've just had a bit of a chat already. Look to use what's native and indigenous to your area as a good start. Probably the first point is to identify what you have on your property and what works for you in your paddocks at the moment with your stock. So if you have a specific species that's not coping well with stock access in your property, or like for example in the Greater catchment, some of the farmers over there have been saying that their yellow box and red box in particular haven't coped well with high stock densities at the base, as well as river red gum has. So for some of those properties, when they go to build paddock trees, they're not putting in more red box because they're not particularly tolerant of high nutrient loads at the base, for example, in our area. So have a think about what's working for you and what's not working for you. And look at what grows naturally in your broader local area. So having a chat, with your neighbours and other landholders, your land care coordinator, have a bit of a look around when you're driving through your area and see if there's others that are working that are close by that might work on your property. And the other thing that I've just put in here is to consider climate change and some shift in species ranges. So in parts of the Greater catchment, the red stringy bark was found a lot lower down into the catchment around Greater West, and we're sort of over time seeing this shifting of the range of those species, and it's retracting back into the higher rainfall and potentially cooler parts of the catchment over time. So we know from climate change, some of the forecasts of the 1.5, 2 degrees over the course of the next 20 or 50 years, where that may put us. And so it might be that yellow box, for example, is a really widespread species. So it grows all the way from Melbourne right up to Rockhampton in Queensland. But maybe what's good is if we put some yellow box in our mix from, say, Dubbo or Holbrook, that's slightly north of us, it's slightly drier. And so the state government's sort of been advocating that in our land care plantings, we actually try and include a little bit of the same species, so still using yellow box, but actually using seed that's sourced from different areas. And a way to do that, rather than sourcing seed and growing your own, is just to go and seek some tube stock from maybe a nursery over the border, J Fields up in Holbrook or something like that, where they are a little bit warmer and drier, and putting some of those into the mix. So in terms of where you can get assistance, probably local nurseries like Park Lane and your local land care group are the best places to start if you're looking at species selection. And the other one is to actually look at our Reveg guides that we have for the Northeast area. And I will include a link to these in the resources that get emailed out after the webinar tonight. So our whole Northeast area is broken into a series of regions, and there's a revegetation guide provided for each region. So this is a little snapshot of what they look like. So this is the Mid Ovens and Lower King region, which includes Greta, Moyu, Markwood, Tarrawingi, sort of through the plains there. And I've just pulled out two of the different vegetation types, plains grassy woodland and valley grassy forest. So your valley grassy forest is more of your sloping hill country. And I've just given you a bit of a list of the recommended trees in both of those vegetation types. So under the plains grassy woodland, so trees are anything that is greater than 5 metres tall. So there's lightwood, which is an acacia, and then you've got 4 eucalyptus species listed there. The ones in bold are the most common species. So in the plains grassy woodland, river red gum and yellow box would be your first port of call, and then maybe you'd add in some grey box or some apple box depending on your particular sites. And this is where it's really good to have a look. These are guides only. It's really good to have a look at your local area and see what's there. With the valley grassy forest, so drier, gentle sloping valley, we've got 3 different acacias in here: silver wattle, lightwood and blackwood. And we've got 6 or 7 eucalypts and cherry bella at the bottom. So you've got a bit more of a selection of what you might like to choose from. So the Reveg guides are a really good starting point for people, and they are quite simple to use. And I'm happy if people have questions about that at any point down the track, they're welcome to give me a call and we can run through them together.
Sal, have you had anyone planting wattles as paddock trees?
No, we haven't. Mainly because in my experience, wattles are really palatable and stock really love eating them. But having said that, we've got some really good examples of really big lightwoods that have established well as natural recruitment, and then when they get up to sort of 2 or 3 metres, they're quite resistant to stock. So we haven't planted any, specifically as paddock trees. Have you? Have you got some experience there?
No, we've tended to stick with the ukes. Yeah, I guess more so because they tend to be more long-lived.
Yep, and I was going to say when your primary aim is, there's a lot of resources and investment of time that goes into planting and guarding these, and my sense that the acacias are going to be more short-lived probably stops them from being quite as valuable as paddock trees as well. In terms of how many trees to target on your property, it probably does come back to what you're trying to achieve and what your needs are. So what I've done here is put in some different rates for us to think about and talk about. And I think you need, in the first instance, think about what your project aims are. So if your main purpose of planting trees on your property is to grow your shade for stock, a handy rule of thumb, and this has been provided in some literature that came to me from Agriculture Victoria, was to allow 4 square metres per cow. And I had a bit of a look through various websites, the MLA and a few others, and they recommended 1 to 2 square metres per sheep. So if you have, a reason, if you have a feeling for what the carrying capacity is and what you usually have as a bit of a herd site on your property, you can work backwards from that and work out how many square metres of shade you need, and then have a look at what you have in your paddocks now. And maybe that might give you a bit of guidance as to how many extra trees you need to plant for shade. I guess the other thing to consider is that the shade that you get at midday versus the shade that you get late afternoon is quite different because of the angle of the sun. So your best shade is going to be in the late afternoon when the western, the sun's dropped in the sky, it's casting its longest shadow across through the canopy of the tree. And that's the time of the day where your shade is most critical too. So we know between 4 p.m. and sort of 7 p.m. at night is the critical time for heat stress for cattle. And that's because that heat builds during the day, and our peak air temperature is often around sort of 5, 6 p.m. So you're also getting at that time of the day biggest angle cast by the sun, and therefore a greater shade area than when the sun is overhead of your tree at midday. In terms of biodiversity, and this is a really hard one, and I'm going to ask Will to jump in here, but in a natural woodland, the recommended spacing for trees, if we're revegetating to a woodland from a clean greenfield site, we try and end up with 50 trees per hectare, and that's reasonably high. Will, do you want to have a chat about the 3 tree per hectare guideline recommendation?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, the 50 tree per hectare is has come from a government benchmark on large old tree density, and what that probably looks like on the ground is the outer boughs or the drip line branches of the tree would be almost touching. So if you're running a commercial farm, that's, you know, your average farmer probably doesn't want 50 trees in the paddock. But some research that we've found indicates that at 2 trees, there's 2 trees per hectare, there's pretty minimal biodiversity in a paddock. But as soon as you get up to, you know, 3 to 4 trees per hectare, it really does start to make a difference in terms of the bird numbers and diversity, and also things like bats that we don't tend to think about too much, but also really important paddock trees provide great habitat for bats. So I think we should be aiming for 3 as a bit of a minimum. So
yep. So if you've got, if your aim is sort of a bit of a mix of biodiversity and shade on your place, might be a really good idea to look at the paddocks that you use over summer the most, and I guess look at what your existing shade is, try and work backwards from your herd size and work out what you think you need in terms of stock shade, and then apply that 3 tree per hectare rule that Will's just discussed, and compare those 2 values and see where you come out. And you might be, you know, you might be quite similar, and therefore you're going to be able to achieve both those aims at once. Like you're maximising your biodiversity returns and you're achieving what you need from a shade point of view. So I think that's how I'd approach that sort of, you know, to give you a feel for how many you need to plant on your place.
And so, sorry, I'll just jump in.
Yeah.
If a landholder doesn't have any way of really knowing how many trees they have per hectare or per acre, is that a service that you're able to provide? Yeah,
we could have probably the way we do it is get them to pop in the expression of interest that they want to look at planting more paddock trees on their property. And what we would do in the first instance is sit down on Zoom with an aerial photo, or probably have a chat on the phone about their property first so I can work out where they are. And I could start to have a bit of a look using an aerial photo of the property, or come out with my laptop with some aerials and we can actually talk that through. So yeah, we can work on that. That's definitely achievable. Did anyone have any questions at this point? Have we got anything else that's come through? No. All right. We might move on to different guard options. Now, for simplicity of talking, I've broken these into 2 categories, homemade guards and prefabricated guards. So when we talk about homemade guards, various options, and I'm going to show some pics at the moment in a minute of all the different types, including old tanks, Rio mesh sheets, temporary fencing panels, 44-gallon drums. We've got a great array of different things that have been trialled around our catchments over the years in that category. And then in the prefabricated line, we've got pre-rolled mesh sheets, and there are various options on the market. Probably the one that's been easiest to get a hold of are the White's rural welded mesh tree guards. They're 1.8 metres high, so they're a standard size, 750mm diameter, 5mm wire, and the whole opening size is 160 by 100mm, so, you know, this sort of size. So They're available through WB Hunters in Wang, and various groups have been bulk ordering those for rolling out for projects. So I thought I'd show some photos. That's one of those prefabricated guards. We've been trialling them for about 4 years, and we've had reasonable levels of success bar 1 or 2 properties for different reasons. So we've put 900 out into circulation in our catchment. So we're starting to get a bit of a sample going of what's working and what's not working. And we've trialled a lot of different homemade guards as well since that time. With the homemade guards, one of the conclusions that we've drawn is it's really important to consider the opening size of your mesh. So this photo here, we've got really big opening, and it's quite a small diameter guard, which means that that tree has been constantly munched off at that happy browsing height and has found it really hard to get up and going beyond that height. So the opening size is critical, and it's going to depend on what stock you have. So if you run sheep versus cattle, the opening size that you need to be aware of is quite different. So, and also if you run young cattle versus old cattle, that will have a big bearing on how far they can reach in through that opening in the mesh. And they'll tend to lick, pull and chew those leaves. So even if they can get a little bit of their snout in, they'll still potentially damage some of your plants. So that's a close-up of that, just constant browsing at that height where they can easily get their nose in through that mesh. So with the larger opening size on your mesh, a larger diameter tree guard is much more successful because they just can't reach in as far. They can still get their nose in, but the tree is a greater distance out into the centre of that circle. So it's easier for the tree to get up and get going. I've seen lots of 44-gallon drums used for weather protection, either as separate guards or as additional protection. I think the main thing there is that you want to get them off your tree before it gets to the point that you can't slip them off over the top. Otherwise, you're looking at having to cut it off down the track so it doesn't restrict the size of your tree. So I have had landholders tell me that this helps with plant establishment. The plants tend to look up towards the light and seek that light quicker. So there's been the conclusion drawn that they tend to put on a bit taller, straighter growth a bit quicker in a guard of that type. Old water tanks make great guards, but a bit like a 44-gallon drum, if you don't get them off in time, they're not going to come off anytime soon. So be resourceful. It is great to reuse different things on your property. This is another landholder who even tried temporary fencing panels as an easy way to get a guard going for stock. And although I think that's quite successful and it does provide for a nice area in the middle for the tree, it's a pretty expensive option because I think our fencing panels are going to work out more than buying sheets of Rio mesh. So I'm going to pass over to Will, who's going to talk about a workshop that he hosted earlier this year as part of the Bush for Birds project, and they had a really good discussion around the various types of guards and what some of the pros and cons were of each.
Thanks, Al. You can flip to the next one. All right, so we tested out 3 different types of materials, noting that a lot of people wouldn't be able to get their hands on things like 44s and tanks, but Rio mesh is pretty readily available. So we tried, there's a couple of, well, many different gauges of Rio mesh that you can use. We tried the 2 lightest gauges, so F52 and F62, and they come in sheets that are, I have to help me sell, I think they're 6 metres long by 2.4 metres tall.
Yep.
So the one in this photo is F62, so I think that just refers to the thickness of the metal, so being 6 mil thick. And obviously these provide a really good diameter. So even with the edges overlapped, I think it was almost a 2 meter diameter. And the F62 is really rigid. So less of a need for lots of star pickets. Having said that, you probably need at least 2 people to put them together because yeah, they're pretty hard work to manhandle. Go to the next one, Sal. So star pickets in or out was a topic of discussion. It's obviously a lot easier to install them on the outside of the guard, but they're more effective on the inside. Probably just a matter of how tall the guard is for one, and whether or not you've got cattle or sheep, or if you're just protecting them from kangaroos. Obviously better being on the inside for cattle. I think, yeah, there's people that are leaving these as high as they are, so 2.4 high, just leaving them like that. There's others who are cutting them in half. Obviously, if you've just got sheep, then cutting them in half is decent protection. The third type we tried was just the prefab. Obviously, much narrower diameter, and really easy to put together. So you could put them together and install them on your own. But being a really narrow diameter, and depending on how many other paddock trees you've got in the paddock, there will tend to be a fair bit of compaction from the stock around the root zone of the tree as they sort of wander around the outside of the guard and rub up against it. So there, did you pop that quote in, Sal? I think
Yeah.
the prefab ones are the most expensive. Yeah. So about, yeah, $56 for the prefab, and then that's comparable to a sheet of F62, but if you're cutting that in half, that's obviously a lot more value for money. We had a crack with the F52, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's even though it's only a mil difference in terms of the thickness of the metal, it does make a world of difference. And I think what you save on buying a sheet of F52, you'd probably be spending on adding more star pickets to make sure the stock couldn't push in the sides. So yeah, I'd either stick with the 62 or just the prefab tree guards. But that previous photo, Sal.
Yeah.
So that's the F62 cut in half, sheep property with 3 steels. You might need to, yeah, if you were running cattle, you'd make it taller and you'd probably add an extra star picket. But you can already see this was probably only planted a couple of months before I took the photo, but you can already see the compaction around the side of the guard from where the stock are walking around, and these are paddocks with a reasonable number of existing old paddock trees, so that compaction is an important consideration, I reckon.
Will, how many with your star pickets, how many, I guess it depends on guard, you've just covered that, it depends on which guard type you choose, but what were you finding with the prefab guards? How many star pickets are you needing on those versus your F62 sheets for, say, cattle, like as a comparison?
Oh, I reckon you'd probably still put 3 on a smaller guard.
Yep.
We had some good advice early on from a landholder who's put in various types of guards, and obviously the narrower prefab ones are more top heavy.
Yep.
So cattle, especially when they're leaning on them, there's more of an inclination for the guard to topple over. So even though it's smaller, you still need the, probably the 3-star pickets.
Yeah. And you'd go 3 on the big sheets of Rio mesh too?
I reckon you could probably get away with 2 for sheep, but maybe 4 for cattle.
Yeah. And what about the number of, like I've sort of been suggesting to people they need to tie off to those star pickets at, 3 spots on each one. Do you think that's, like for sheep, you could get away with, if you're going to do a half-high guard, is 2 tie-off points enough just to give people a bit of a starting point?
Yeah, so it looks like they've done 2 there, but 3 is probably a bit better. We've been, well, in the workshop we used, I'm not sure what the technical name for them is, but concreters use them to attach Rio sheets together. And they're basically small bits of wire with a loop at each end, and they join the loops and use this twisting tool. It has a hook that sort of really easily twitches the wire, so you don't have to constantly do that by hand.
Yep.
So you can get those, in a pack of 1,000, I think, from a farm supplies joint, and they make that process a lot easier. But yeah, probably 3 would be better.
That looks good.
Having said that, they are pretty lightweight. The bits of wire they use for concreting. So if you've got cattle, maybe use a thicker gauge tire wire, or just a soft fencing wire would probably be ideal.
Yep. Did anyone have any questions about installation at the moment? All right, we'll save any other questions for the end of this. We've got a couple more slides. Just in terms of arrangement in the paddock, it's worth thinking about how you want to plant them and what sort of overall outcome you're looking for. So in terms of shade, I usually say to people, you've got a few options. You can go with singles, you can go with little clusters of 3 or 5, you can do some blocks or some patches. And if you're looking from a biodiversity point of view, you might like to do some corridors. So it's worth thinking back to what your project aim is. What do you need? I think that little clusters in the paddock probably work better from a shade point of view, because over time those canopies will start to actually grow together and touch, and you'll get nice little shady areas between them. And if you've got a cluster of trees, they're probably going to offer each other a little bit more wind protection than if you've got a whole lot of single trees out on their own. So to maximise your shade benefits, consider where you need that shade. So maybe it's near your troughs. If you want to maximise the shade from those trees, I'd be saying, focus them on the northern side of your paddock or on the western side of your paddock. That way you get the greatest spread of shade into the paddock that you need at the hottest part of the day. And from a biodiversity point of view, where do you need to improve the connectivity across your property? And if you're trying to target habitat for a specific fauna, thinking about where they may be and where they may need to move to, and then looking at patterns of movement across your property. So singles, this is an example of a single 3-star pickets that we've used. It's one of the prefabricated guards. We always plant them with some form of protection down the bottom from browsing from rabbits, and a smaller cardboard guard, just to give your trees a bit of a head start over the first winter. Cardboard's probably better. You don't have to have the risk of bits of plastic flowing around if this breaks down over time, and it will biodegrade itself, so you don't have to go back and remove a plastic sleeve down the track. We've had reasonable successes with the prefab guards, like I mentioned before, on all bar one of our properties that has got some pretty robust bulls that have given a lot of these guards a hard time in particular paddocks. But certainly for horses, sheep, and people that rotationally graze and stock are in paddocks for short amount of times, the guards have performed really well. It does also depend on what other timber and scratching areas that you might have in your paddocks as well, because if they want to lean on something and have a scratch, the guards are a pretty nice option. So this is an example of planting sort of a triangle, a cluster of 3 trees spaced 10 to 15 metres apart, and hopefully over time those canopies will grow up and meet in the middle. This is over at Greta West. That's probably, they were only about 2 years old, I think, those trees. So they got going really well. There was a white box, a red box, and a yellow box, I think, in that cluster. And then we've had landholders do everything up to sort of 11 trees in clumps on their property, and that's another way of building sort of patches of shade. Will, I thought you might like to talk a little bit more about the planting arrangement for biodiversity and the different ways that you might be able to achieve that on your property.
Yeah, I'd probably preface this by saying these maps don't necessarily represent an ideal quantity or distribution of trees. Given that this is, given that the paddock trees here are project funded and there's defined timeframes around when they need to go in, resources was a really important consideration. So I think the first discussion I would have had with the landholders was, how many do you think you're going to be able to put in next year? And thinking about, how many human resources, how many volunteers or workers they'll have to install the paddock trees, what sort of time they have, and also financial resources, noting that often these grants don't cover all of the costs, and certainly things like labour aren't covered. So with that in mind, we came up with a number that we thought was realistic and achievable within the time frame. And I think I mentioned to you, Sal, we've done a bit ourselves, and I think a couple of us put in maybe 20 paddock trees in a day, just the prefab guards, starting from scratch without any sort of site prep. But obviously, if you're using Rio mesh, that takes a lot longer to construct. So we had a family group of 5 or 6 people who were putting in 20 a day using the Rio mesh. So that's a little bit of a guide. So this is a site out at Greta West, obviously, where I think we're putting in about 100 new paddock trees. And across most of the site, we could have a fairly even distribution with about a 50 metre spacing or a bit bigger. And what that means is, things like arboreal mammals like squirrel gliders and sugar gliders can actually glide that distance between from one tree to another. So it does provide that connectivity across the landscape. Thanks, Sal.
Would you like me to move to the next slide, Will?
Yeah, cheers. This was a bigger property, I think around a couple 100 hectares, where I guess the number of paddock trees the landholders wanted to put in, or what they thought was realistic, wouldn't provide a coverage across the entire property. So what we were looking at as an alternative to the previous slide is just providing some stepping stones and connectivity through the landscape. So we're going from so that's the Wang Yarra Road,
This one, yeah.
with the ovens over on over towards the east, and the warbies over to the west. So obviously a great place to be providing connectivity for wildlife. And having said that, though, I think any paddock trees you put in can serve multiple functions. So we've got a bit of a cluster sort of around the house up in the northeast corner there, which are intended to provide a bit more protection from the stronger southwesterly winds, but they're also providing a good spread of stock shade and shelter in the paddocks, and also connectivity through the property. So in this situation, we're really looking at what's there initially. So there's a really nice area of creek line down along that western boundary. So we were supplementing that. We were basically infilling that with a woodland spacing of trees, and then providing more sort of linear connectivity west to east and north to south through the property. That also provided a good distribution of trees in each paddock for stock shade and shelter. Thanks, Sal. And so if we just jump back to the previous slide for a sec, that was
Planned.
the planned, and we provided a big A1 laminated map to the landholders that they took out with them when they were doing all the planting and drew all over, which is great. And then subsequently we went around and GPS'd all of the paddock trees that had gone in, and they did really well with the locations that they put them in. And yeah, so they've gone from in some situations like that sort of central eastern paddock where they've got one living tree left to now a really good number. So that was a really successful project. Great year to get them in the ground as well. And yeah, this is probably just a bit of a repeat of the first map, in that slightly smaller property. So in this situation, only about 25 hectares, I think. So with 75 paddock trees, I think we were able to get a really good coverage across the entire property, and that was achievable for the landholder to doing it in a year. Thanks, Sal.
That looks fantastic. It's great. I guess that leads us on to the actual mechanics of planting. And look, I've just put together, Will and I've put together a bit of a list of tips for you. First slide is preparation and what you might need to do it well. I'm going to say that weed control is probably your most essential thing, that if you can get on top of it early and spray at least once, but maybe 2 sprays before you actually plant, that'll have a great impact on reducing competition from grass. Ripping might be an option if your soil's really compacted and really hard, that you might want to run across it, do it across nearby and increase a bit of infiltration into your subsoils. Third point, purchasing good quality, healthy tube stock, I think. So starting with your healthiest plants that you can. I've put down avoid mature trees, only because I think that the cost of purchasing mature trees is not warranted, and it's that leaf area versus root structure that's going to be a limiting factor down the track. And we have had one landholder that planted out 100 mature trees that were yellow box, and admittedly they were planted 2 summers ago when the conditions were really tough, but they haven't thrived. And I think when you've got such a big leaf area to keep going through your first summer with a really small root mass, it's a tough ask out there in the paddock. It's pretty hard conditions. So a tube stock, cheap and cheerful, well planted, I think is going to set you off streets ahead of buying mature trees. Star pickets, you'll need to probably supply them. A lot of the grants that the groups are funding, they're supplying guards, and the landholder in-kind contribution, like Will mentioned, is usually the miscellaneous bits like your star pickets and your wire for your twitching and your labour. So look to have 2 for sheep and 3 or 4 for cattle, depending on your grazing regime and the age of your stock. Twitch to your picket, at least 3 points. I think we've covered that. And if you are set stocking these, you might want to use even longer than your standard star pickets and drive them into the ground further, just to make sure that they're even stronger and a bit more bulletproof if you can. In terms of actually planting, and this would apply to any re-veg that you might look to do on your property, give them a good soak the night before, either just with straight water, or if you have it, a real low dose of sea salt, so that those plants are really wet. They'll come out of the tube better the next day when you go to plant them and they've already had a good drink. Water them well on the day. That removes any air pockets from around the plant and gives them a good starting point. Use a cardboard guard or a claw flute guard for protection from browsing animals. So it might depend on what your browsers are. If you have a lot of kangaroos, then a 600 high claw flute guard would be probably a great investment, because kangaroos are going to be able to reach in through the sides of these guards, potentially, depending on which diameter guard you use. So using one of these is a very small additional expense that does help to protect your tree in the first 12 to 18 months. Gold star treatment would be to mulch around your trees. So you can put down a bit of newspaper first to kill weeds, and then straw, bark or chip on top of that. I tend to keep that mulch away from the stem of the plant a little bit, but I don't know how susceptible our natives are and whether they like that. That's just probably a bit of a gardening habit. You can form a water well around the base when you're planting, so a bit of a mound of dirt, which will help to retain a little bit of water when you tip it in with your watering can or your hose over summer. And you can get plastic collars, which the rural city of Wayne use them on all their street trees. And we have started to do some trials with those. They hold about 20 litres and you just wiggle them down. It does mean you can sort of put a whole lot of water in quick and walk away, and then that slowly infiltrates down through your profile. So those plastic water wells, they're available at Bunnings as well. They might be something that you want to look at. And lastly, probably avoid staking or tying your plants if you can. Try and let them develop their own lateral strength in wind. The farmer that we had that used the mature stock, we found that in the windy sites, they were very tall and whippy and constantly blowing in one direction with the wind, and they were getting browsed through the sides of those prefab guards because the diameter is quite narrow, and they actually could revert to sort of tying them back into the middle of the guards. And I think that that's a lot of work, and I do think that trees need to develop that lateral stability themselves, and if you tie them up, it's probably going to weaken that a little bit. So this is one of my landholders that mulched using straw that the sheep then came and pulled through the sides of all of his guards. So up went some chicken wire around the sides of those guards as well to then help keep the mulch in place. So mulch is good, but think about what might like to eat it is the moral of the story, because you may find your mulch disappearing quicker than you can replace it. So some of the threats to success, Will has covered this really brilliantly. The time and labour to install your guards is probably your primary consideration. So for a one-person crew, probably allow an hour for a prefabricated guard and maybe 2 hours for Rio mesh. Bearing in mind the big F62 guards that Will was talking about, you're going to need a couple of people to help bend those into shape and hold them. So it really is a bit of a team effort. Big threat to success, browsing, rabbits, hares, kangaroos, and stock. So if your stock are really, causing problems with those smaller diameter guards, then the obvious solution to that is to move to something with a bigger diameter or a smaller mesh size so that they can't get their noses in. Some of the paddock conditions are going to be really tough. The microclimates are really tough. That's one tree out there on its own in full wind, full sun. You may need to water over the first summer, depending on the season. This year, we've been blessed with a lot of great regular spring rain. So, and if we get some good summer storm activity, our re-veg might make it through without need watering at all. But generally, you might need to water that first summer. I've put one of the threats to success, vivacious stock. Some people think that their stock are not going to impact on these guards at all until they get them out there, and then the cattle really realise how great it is to rub on them. So that's something that you will learn yourself when you start to do this. And one of my landholders has said that when he then went and did some further treatment for mites and lice, that degree of rubbing on his tree guards actually reduced. So it's worth having a look at why your stock are rubbing on them and whether there's some other treatment that you might need to consider. If you're using a post hole digger or an auger to help plant, please rough up the sides of that hole with a crowbar or a shovel afterwards to make sure that you haven't created a very smooth-sided little, basically like a bigger pot to plant your tree into. So break that soil up as much as you can in the bottom to make sure that those roots don't hit a hard pan formed by that auger and not go down further. And my last one was that I don't think advanced trees are worth the money, and that using tube stock is probably a good way to go. Did anyone have any questions? That's the end of what Will and I had to talk about. I'm conscious that we've already chatted for about an hour, so we're happy to do 15 minutes of question time. Everyone can unmute themselves and turn their videos on if they'd like to.
So there's a question in the chat from Karen Sell, or maybe just a comment. We're planting in clusters of 4 every 200 metres to start with. We did learn the hard way to have mesh of a thick enough gauge. So thank you for that, Karen.
Sally, just a comment about the acacias. I planted several hundred on a creek regeneration project along the banks of Reedy Creek in 2000, and they've actually become a menace. They've become so prolific in self-seeding, they're a real nuisance, but some of the 2000 ones are actually already dying. So I'm not sure the lifespan, but some of them are actually dying. And but the regeneration is actually so prolific, it's become a bit of a problem in terms of me getting access for weed control through there.
Yeah, and acacias do have that ability to produce a lot of seed, and I guess that's more of their role as they're a bit of a colonizer. They'll, you know, the parent tree will die off, it'll drop a lot of seed, and you hope that they replace over time. In a paddock, those regenerated acacias would be pretty tasty feed for stock, I would imagine. So you often don't get as many coming back up, but along a waterway that's fenced out from stock, yep, they'll recruit very well. It's a good observation, Craig. Any other questions? Well, that either means we've been really thorough and we've covered everything, or...
I had a question about the regrowth. We had a lot of regrowth in certain clusters, and some of the areas have been going for about 10 years. So the trees are semi-mature, getting to like between 3 to 5 meters tall. So I've done a bit of thinning out, like, because some of the trees are really, I guess, scraggly. They've got a lot of trunks and stuff, but I'm not sure if it's like damaging the trees. So my question is, do you know of like a best practice thinning of regrowth trees?
Will, are you happy to answer that one? You've had a good amount of experience with thinning through the trust.
Sorry, just in terms of best practice density, was it?
Not really the density of trees, but like thinning. Is there such thing as over thinning the trees, like cutting off too much?
We have had examples where, and often it'll happen where a lot of recruitment will come up underneath a large old tree. And so a lot of thinning is done underneath the tree just to maintain its health.
Yeah.
But that the roots of the trees are all interconnected, and there's interconnected via, you know, mycorrhizae and things like that. And so there's actually been dieback from the mature tree as a lot of the young saplings have been cut and poisoned. So obviously the roots are drawing in a bit of that herbicide. So that'd be a consideration. In terms of can you over thin, it depends what you're thinning for, I guess. If it's in a paddock and you're thinning more for stock shade and shelter, you'd probably want a density of maybe a tree every 10 meters, like a 10-meter spacing or more.
Okay.
Which often means, like Sel said, you're taking out, you know, more than 90% of the trees. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think probably worth noting on that the best time to do your thinning, like I mentioned, is when the trees are small, because it's easier to deal with and you can get in sooner. Under your native vegetation removal guidelines that's administered by the state government through our local council, I think you can legally thin, it's up to 10 years, isn't it, Will, from a recruitment event? Or is it by diameter size in natural recruitment? Probably
if it's on land that's previously been cleared and it's regrowth, you can remove it if it's less than 10 years old.
Less than 10 years old. So you've got a 10-year window from when that recruitment event starts, so either that flood or that really wet year that caused that germination, to get in and remove and thin any seedlings that you want to. After that 10 years, technically you'd need a permit through council to remove native vegetation, and that becomes a bit of a process.
Okay.
So I would be recommending to people that if they need to do this, to get in before that 10-year mark, and that the sooner in that window you do it, the easier it is. And the better, because even after 10 years, your trees have already started to reach a pretty high rate, and they've already taken on a start of a specific growth form. So the earlier you can get to them, probably the better, I think.
Okay. Just quickly, another question adding on to that. I find that in the regrowth areas, there tends to be a dry patch adjacent to it, where for some reason grass doesn't grow. Is that just purely because the trees are taking up a lot of the moisture in the ground, not allowing any grass to grow around that? Or is there something to do with compaction or too many trees or something like that? Are you aware of?
Well, it's probably very site specific, Seth. I don't think it's an easy one to make a call on. It could be a different soil type.
Yeah.
Could be slightly higher and therefore it dries out a bit quicker.
Yeah.
If it was a bit more sandy or a bit more clayey, that would have a big bearing on it.
Is it regrowth coming up from roadside veg, Seth, or?
No, just coming up from paddock trees. So it's in, middle of the paddocks kind of things.
It wouldn't be some salinity form, would it?
What was that, sorry?
It wouldn't be some process of salinity that often leaves a dead sort of patch in paddocks?
I haven't actually thought about that, but I could look into that maybe actually. Could be.
Often the mature trees, and you see it a lot along roadsides where they'll actually suppress the ground layer vegetation and any recruitment. So I'd say it's probably more likely the mature tree that's having that effect.
Thank you very much.
But,
did have another question. Oh, sorry, Will.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I think it'll probably be a really good year for natural regeneration. A lot of the stuff where we've been thinning at the moment is regen that came up late in the millennium drought. So it tends to be those periods when the ground cover's really bared off by a severe summer or a drought period, and then that's followed on by a bit of rain like we had in I think 2010, 2011. So we've had a similar type of period lately where we've had a period that's been really dry and a lot of ground cover's been pared off, and we've had a pretty good year rain-wise this year. So keep an eye out for recruitment. But there's a couple of questions there in the comments. So a good one for you. What do you suggest would be a good size area to fence off old trees?
Thanks, Karen. We talked a little bit about that in our last workshop. So as a minimum, you need to be outside of the drip line of your tree. So out beyond the edges of your branches and canopy. So it depends on what you want to achieve with the tree. If you just want to stop rubbing the bark around the base and compaction on the roots and nutrients left at the base of the tree, then probably just outside of the drip line is going to achieve that. But if you do want to do any planting or any establishment of shrubs at the same site to try and enhance the habitat and the biodiversity at that site, you're going to need to do a distance outside of the drip line to be able to get those shrubs to grow. And that's all for the same reasons that we've just talked about with Seth. So you're fighting for competition for light and for moisture, and those big, large old trees really suppress the establishment of other plants under the base. So on that photo that I've got there at the moment, this was years ago that we attempted planting near this tree, and it's just too small a site to get shrubs. We have got some going in the corners of these sites, but a lot of the ones that the landholder popped in here quite close under the canopy never got going. And that's because they were particularly dry years following, but also for the reasons that we were talking about. So as a minimum, underneath the canopy, fence out to there. But if you want to get other shrubs or potentially encourage natural regeneration growing, you could probably fence an area twice that size and try and encourage some recruitment further out from that canopy of the tree. The second question there from David was, how far do you auger down your hole when planting a euc or gum? Look, from a personal opinion, when I'm doing planting, I try and go twice the depth of the pot. So if you're using tube stock, and the pots for tube stocks are probably at max 15 centimetres high, you probably dig a hole, 25, 30 centimetres deep, and break up the soil in the base. I really advocate, I'm a real shovel planter, and a lot of our best successes in our catchment have been done using shovels for planting. You've got your opportunity to use a tree planter, but it depends a lot on soil type and the conditions in the paddock, and whether you've got a really, well drained, soft, light, loamy soil or a really hard, compacted clay. So I would say a minimum of twice the depth of your pot. Will, any experience to add to that?
Oh, yeah, I think if you've got access to an auger and the soil's not too clayey, which when you auger it tends to have that glazing effect on the sides if it's high clay soil. But if you can get down a couple of feet, then what we've found is the soil actually settles after a couple of decent rainfall events, and then that creates a bit of a well itself, which holds the water. So yeah, if the soil's right, have a good crack with your auger, get down, half a metre if you can, and then the soil will settle a bit and it'll provide a good dish to collect the rainfall.
And time of year would be critical for that, because if you're going to do that digging when your soil's already really wet, that would be the worst possible time to do it. So I guess if you approach it late summer or just after the first rains of autumn, when you've got a little bit of soil moisture but not too much, you might get that best sort of cracking and ripping and breaking up of the subsoil when you use your auger. Rather than in the depths of winter, I think that that would be harder and more at risk of having those glazed sides that we was talking about. Do we have any final questions this evening, or is everybody happy? Great. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope we've answered all your questions and given you something constructive to think about. I will send around a list of resources and some links after the webinar with a link to this recording in case you wanted to rewatch it or forward it on to a neighbour or a friend. And if anyone's thinking of putting in an expression of interest, I'm really happy to talk about that with you individually if you'd like to call, or send me an email with some details and we can have a chat about that as well. So thanks all for attending, and thank you, Will, for coming on board and sharing your experiences with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sal, and feel free to include my contact details in your email out. Happy to have people give me a buzz with any queries, and I often get people texting through photos of plants and that sort of thing, asking what's this or what's that. So yeah, happy for people to get in touch.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important that we all share our learnings and our experiences from projects like this so that we don't have to recreate the wheel each time. So if people have things that they've tried that have worked and haven't worked, it's a great idea to share that with your group so that we can pass it on to others. And in that way, we all move forward with a bit of shared knowledge and commonality. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Will.